I never saw it coming. She was my everything, my beautiful wife. But that night, I walked into our bedroom and my world shattered. Her betrayal cut deeper than any knife. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the same eyes that once promised me forever. I felt the rage boiling inside me, a burning need for revenge. As I watched them together, I knew I had to act. The love of my life, now a stranger. How did it come to this? And what would I do next? My name is Bryan, and this is my story. It was a busy Thursday afternoon at the airport departure lounge. On one side, there were fast food places and shops. On the other, rows of escalators led to baggage control and boarding gates. In front of the escalators were barriers marked for passengers only. This is where people said their goodbyes. Today, Becky Sanford was saying goodbye to her parents. Her father finally kept his promise and was taking her mother on a 6-week trip around America. Both were older with white hair, and they seemed a bit surprised that this was really happening, like they might wake up from a dream. But the tight hug Becky got from her mother was very real. "Thank you, dear," her mother whispered. "God bless you." Becky's throat tightened, and tears filled her eyes. The women shared a nod before her parents picked up their rolling suitcases and walked through the gate. Becky watched them go up the escalator, waving every time her mother turned around. Then they were gone, off to their new adventure. Becky wiped away a tear and turned to leave. She was heading straight for the parking lot, but didn't want to go back to her regular life just yet. Instead, Becky went to one of the fast food places, bought a latte in a paper cup, and sat down at a high counter with bar stools. From there, she could watch everything happening in the terminal. She sipped her latte and enjoyed watching people go by. Becky wasn't very religious, but her mother's blessing touched her deeply. Part of her felt grateful for helping her father keep his promise. But more important was the end of the silent fight between Becky and her mother. Her mother's last nod and look said, "We are okay, my dear daughter. We are fine." The fight had started when Becky and her husband, Bryan, renewed their marriage vows earlier this year without inviting family or friends. Even the 2 witnesses were church staff. They kept it secret, but when Becky asked her parents to take care of Tara for a few days, her mother got curious. Becky told her the truth, and her mother was very upset. Her mother believed marriage vows should be made in front of family and loved ones, especially with Tara there to see it. Becky argued that they had already done their original vows publicly and wanted this moment to be private. "This is between me and Bryan," Becky said. Her mother then asked quietly, "Did Bryan do something, my dear?" "No, Mom." "Then did you do something?" Becky paused but didn't cry. She remembered Marcus DeVere, the man she almost cheated with. If he hadn't been there, she might have cheated. But she looked her mother in the eyes and said, "This is between me and Bryan." It was her final word, and she would rather cut her mother out of her life than say more. So her mother stopped and agreed to look after Tara. But after that, things were cool between the 2 women. As Becky sipped her latte, she realized the coldness had melted like it was now spring. Her mother had let go of her anger, and Becky was grateful. She promised herself she would do the same for Tara when she grew up. Just then, a woman in a raincoat walked by, pulling a burgundy suitcase. Their eyes met for a moment, and the woman turned away. Then she quickly looked back, recognizing Becky. The woman had gray eyes and cherry-red hair. A name came to Becky's mind: Siobhan. The woman froze, looking at Becky like a deer in headlights. Becky stood up and looked over the barrier of the cafe. "Oh my God, it's really you," Becky said. "But you were blonde, weren't you?" "I haven't been blonde in years," said Siobhan. "Got it, sorry." Siobhan looked classy in her coat and boots, with a matching silk scarf and suitcase. She walked closer, and Becky remembered how they first met in a crowded pub. Becky had just met Bryan, and Siobhan worked for him back then. It was before Bryan's old partner, Eric, secretly made a deal with new investors and pushed Bryan out of his own company. That was a long time ago, though. "Hi," Siobhan said tiredly. "This is Becky, right?" "Yes, it's me." "Wow, what a surprise." "What, meeting me here?" "Oh, yes, of course." "What are the chances of this happening?" Siobhan nodded and smiled awkwardly. Becky's smile matched hers. She was searching for something to say. "Are you still working for Eric?" Becky asked. "No, Siobhan replied. God, no. Half the staff left within 6 months of Brian's departure. I was one of them. Really? Becky asked. Yes, Siobhan confirmed. It wasn't the same without Brian. He'll be glad to hear it. What? Are you two still together? Becky's surprise was clear, and it made her uncomfortable. Siobhan, realizing she had blundered, quickly apologized. Sorry, I didn't mean it like that. What did you mean? Becky pressed. I was just surprised, Becky, Siobhan explained. Why, Siobhan? Why is it so surprising that Brian and I have a good marriage? Becky stood tall, glaring at Siobhan. Memories and strong feelings from that time came rushing back. Arguments, worries, everything. Siobhan also stood up straighter, looking Becky in the eye. When she spoke, her voice had lost its apologetic tone. Because you were terrible to Brian, she said. When he needed you most, you just put him down. You don't know what happened, Becky retorted. I was there, Siobhan cut in. Yes, stabbing Brian in the back. He knew if he fought, the whole company would fall apart and everyone would lose their jobs. That's why he agreed to the settlement. And why you called him a loser. Every wife gets angry with her husband. Not like you, Becky. Siobhan took a step closer. What wife says to her husband, a real man would have seen this coming, or a real man would know how to protect his interests, or even Eric's wife is lucky because she's not married to a weakling? Becky turned white, speechless. How did Siobhan know what she had said to Brian in private all those years ago? Sure, Brian must have told her, but in what context? Seeing the horror on Becky's face, Siobhan seemed to enjoy it. Becky's anger gave way to shock. She saw real hate in Siobhan's eyes, which shocked her. How could anyone hate her? Siobhan walked up to the barrier and whispered passionately, almost as if enjoying the drama. Then she turned and walked away, head high, disappearing into the crowd. Becky watched her go up the escalator, heading for a flight to who knows where. That evening, Becky sat barefoot on the couch, picking at her nails. She tried to distract herself with her phone, but decided to just think things through. Bryan was putting their daughter, Tara, to bed. Becky didn't want him to use her emotions against her this time. She thought deeply about everything that had happened, trying to understand why she was so upset. She even planned what she would say to Bryan and how she would respond to his likely excuses. She was determined to confront Bryan. She dismissed the idea that Siobhan might be lying. It was clear Siobhan knew too much. Becky heard Bryan's footsteps and stopped picking her nails. She took a deep breath and prepared for the talk. Bryan came in, closing the door quietly. He stood for a moment, looking at her. Want a drink? He asked. No thanks, she replied politely, which warned Bryan that trouble was coming. They had kept their talk casual with Tara around, but now that they were alone, he needed to know what was on her mind. He sat down, facing her. Okay, what's going on? He asked. Becky usually would have smiled at this, but not today. She cleared her throat and spoke calmly. I ran into someone at the airport, someone who worked for you when you were Eric's partner. Bryan's face darkened. He looked down, controlling his breathing. Becky watched him closely. She knew he was trying to stay calm, but she could almost feel his anxiety. Who was it? He asked. I think you know who, Becky said. And I think you know what she told me. Was it Siobhan? Don't play with me, Bryan. You're the one keeping me in the dark, he snapped. Did you cheat on me with Siobhan? Becky's words hit like a bomb. Bryan's reaction was clear, shock, then dread. He realized lying was pointless. He took a deep breath and said coldly, Okay, yes, I did. Becky nodded, lips pressed together. How many times? She asked. Once, he replied. Oh, really? Yes. Why should I believe you? I can't control what you believe. That's not an answer, Bryan. You either believe me or you don't. And I ask, why should I believe you? I don't know why you should. Maybe you shouldn't. Do you want to believe me? No, I want to hurt you. I hate you. Becky was crying hard, screaming. Bryan tried to hug her, but she pushed him away. Stay away, she shouted. Stay away from me. Bryan raised his hands and stepped back to the couch. Becky stayed on the floor, crying. Bryan waited quietly. After about 10 minutes, she lifted her heavy head and looked at him. How can you be so calm? She asked. I'm not calm, Bryan said. I'm just really, really sad. Then why aren't you crying? I don't know. Maybe because I feel like I deserve it. Deserve what? To lose your marriage, your family, to get divorced. No, Becky said, standing up. No, you can't bring up divorce. I get to decide that. Becky, listen. No, you listen. You cheated on me, then lied about it. And you had the nerve to act hurt about Marcus, knowing well you were just as guilty. Actually, more guilty. I just thought about it. And you did it. Seriously, Bryan, are you going to make excuses? Becky stood over Bryan, hands on hips like an angry figure. Bryan looked down, ashamed. No, Bryan said. Okay, I understand your point. So you agree I get to decide what happens next? What do you mean? Just a few months ago, Bryan, I stood in church and promised to love, respect, and obey you. Not because you're a man, and I should follow a man, but because I thought you were a better leader than me. I thought you had the strength I didn't have. Becky paused. Bryan looked very upset. Well, Becky continued, I feel pretty foolish right now. Becky, don't you dare say sorry. I'll be so mad if you even think about it. Bryan looked at her but stayed silent. What I want, Becky said calmly, is to decide for myself what I want. I don't know yet if I should stay married to you, but I want the freedom to figure it out. After what you did, I think you owe me that. What do you think, Bryan? That seems fair. Fine, Becky said, taking a deep breath. The worst is over. She looked at Bryan, not as angry now. From tonight on, I'm sleeping in the guest room. Becky, No, Bryan. I want to sleep in the guest room. You can stay in our bed if it means something to you. Bryan swallowed and nodded. Becky looked at the floor. No, she said, no. What? Nothing. I'm going to sleep. Don't you want to discuss this? I think we've said enough, don't you? Bryan looked at her bare feet, looking lost. Becky could see he wanted her love, which made her feel a small victory. Good night, she said, leaving the room and closing the door. Becky woke up late the next morning. She lay in bed, tired but happy to be working from home. She heard Bryan and their daughter Tara downstairs. Tara's laugh rang out, followed by Bryan's cheerful voice. Becky knew she didn't want to keep Tara from her father. She loved seeing Bryan be a good father. Why can't relationships just work instead of being like a job? She thought. Tara's footsteps came up the stairs. Becky sat up as Tara walked in. Tara looked ready for school. Oh, said Tara, quickly stepping out and closing the door. Becky was about to say something when she heard a knock. Come in, Becky laughed. Tara came back and climbed onto the bed. Becky checked to make sure Tara wasn't wearing shoes and hugged her. Are you going to school? Becky asked. Yes, Mom, Tara said. Mom, can I ask you a question? Sure, honey. Why are you sleeping here? I couldn't sleep last night and didn't want to wake your father. That's why I overslept. Okay, Tara said uncertainly. Will you pick me up? Of course, dear. It's Friday. I always pick you up on Friday. Cool. Tara hugged Becky again and then headed out the door. Becky stopped her. Leave the door open, honey, and ask Daddy to come see me before you go. Okay, fine. Tara went downstairs again, leaving the door open. Becky clearly heard the conversation. Bryan's response was calm and positive. You wouldn't think his marriage was falling apart. Becky got out of bed and put on her robe. She heard Bryan coming up the stairs and went to stand behind the bed. Her arms were crossed tightly when he came through the door. Good morning, he said. Becky nodded, not trusting her voice to sound right. She coughed and said, Why did you tell Tara I was sleeping here? Bryan replied, Well, we were having breakfast. She asked why you weren't coming down. What did you say to her? Becky asked. I told her to ask you, which meant telling her you were in the guest room, Bryan explained. Why didn't you just say I was resting? Becky pressed. I didn't know that, Bryan answered. For goodness sake, Bryan, think about it. Bryan's jaw tightened. He closed the door quietly and spoke in a lower voice. We agreed not to speak for each other, remember? He said. If Tara asks about you, she asks you. If she asks about me, she asks me. If the other parent isn't available, she has to wait. Bryan, that's for important things. Everything you tell your child is important, she argued. Don't act superior. You're in no position, Bryan said. I'm not trying to be, Becky snapped back. That's not true. Tara trusts you and admires you. She doesn't know who you really are. Bryan looked at Becky, thinking of what to say, but decided to stay silent. They both heard Tara's faint voice calling from downstairs. Bryan opened the door and shouted, What, Tara? We have to go, she replied. Bryan checked the time on his phone and frowned. "Darn, she's right," he said. "Then go, run away," Becky said. "You know, Becky, you're not perfect either." "Yes, but I haven't been unfaithful," she shot back. She crossed her arms and glared at him. "You jerk!" Bryan sighed heavily and left the room. After a few minutes, he and Tara left, leaving Becky alone in the quiet house. Becky set up her laptop, work papers, and fully charged phone on the dining room table. She showered, got dressed, and made herself a pot of strong coffee. But after half an hour, she realized she couldn't focus. Becky leaned back and rubbed her temples, wondering what to do. She could go to the office. Working around others was usually easier, but as soon as she thought about it, her body screamed, "No!" Becky knew that if she went, she might tell someone what happened, and she didn't want that. She knew from experience that women tended to take her side. Though it was tempting to complain about Bryan and men in general, something inside warned her that there was too much at stake. Sitting with her coffee, Becky realized she didn't have any close friends. All the women she knew were either Tara's classmates' moms or work colleagues. She could trust them to look after her daughter or keep a promise, but she couldn't trust them with her deepest thoughts, thoughts even she could barely express. People she knew would judge her or Bryan and offer their own opinions. The only person Becky trusted to really listen to her was Bryan. "What a mess," Becky said to herself. "Are you just arguing?" said an inner voice. "Or do you want his help?" Becky groaned inside. Her mother always hated it when she used God's name in vain. It felt like her mother was still judging her from miles away. "Okay, I swore," Becky said in her mind, "but seriously, if you have anything to say that could help, I'm listening. Remember, the vow you made in that church wasn't to Bryan, but to God," the voice said. "You didn't promise Bryan you'd be a better wife if he'd be a better husband. You promised God you'd be a better wife, period." "So if Bryan cheats, I still have to be a good wife?" Becky asked. "Yes, but this is madness," the voice replied. "Bryan breaking his vow is between him and God. That has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," Becky argued. "Really? If Bryan neglects Tara, does that mean you can neglect her too?" the voice said. "That's different." "Why is it different? The principles you apply as parents work for you and Bryan. Why not use these principles as husband and wife?" "What principles are you talking about?" Becky asked. "Well, isn't that what you need to find out?" the voice replied. Becky sat, twirling her empty coffee cup in her hands, staring into space. Her heart was racing and she had a bad taste in her mouth. "Why are you afraid?" asked the inner voice. "I don't know," Becky said to herself. "Yes, you do," the voice pressed. "Oh, shut up. Why does this hurt you so much?" "Because I love him," Becky screamed in her head. "I love him not because of how he makes me feel, or because he's a great father, or because he meets my needs. I love him, and it makes me mad to realize how much I love him only after he cheated on me. I now have the right to divorce without any blame, but I don't want to," she admitted. "Why not?" asked the voice. "Because it's so unfair. If I cheated, Bryan would divorce me, no questions asked. He would say, 'I love you, Becky, but I can't stay.' And that would be it. He would forgive me and leave. So I feel I should do the same with him. If I don't do the same with him, I'll feel like I'm not being true to myself. You get what I'm saying, Becky? These worries are real, and you need to face them, but it hurts a lot, and it's scary. I know, dear. I know, Mom." Becky looked up, half thinking her mom was there, but of course she wasn't. This was all in her head. Realizing she was alone with no one to hold her, Becky started crying hard. Bryan's office was a big, modern building with large windows letting in lots of sunlight. On the ground floor, there was a self-service cafe with food and drink on one side and seating on the other. Bryan paid for his tuna sandwich and sparkling water, then looked for a table. Just as he put his tray down, his phone rang. It was Becky. Bryan took a deep breath and answered. "Hello?" he said. "Hello, Bryan. Can you talk?" Becky asked. "I just started my lunch break," Bryan replied. "So yes, I can talk." Becky's voice was calm and emotionless, which worried him. Bryan placed his free hand on the table to steady himself. "I want to go away for the weekend," she said. "I need to be alone to think." "Okay," Bryan said. "Can you take care of Tara?" Sure, he replied. There was a pause before Bryan asked, When do you want to leave? Tonight, Becky said, and I'll be back Sunday evening. Do you want me to pick Tara up from school? No, I'll do it. I promised her and I want to keep my word. She went quiet. Bryan imagined the unspoken words. This might be the last time Tara sees me as part of a whole family. Becky cleared her throat. Okay, Bryan, she said. That's all I wanted to ask. Thanks for helping. Goodbye, Bryan. The call ended. Bryan knew he would cry soon, so he left his tray on the table and rushed to the men's room, sliding his phone into his pocket. He pushed open the door and saw one guy at the urinal, but all the stalls were empty. Bryan went into the last one, locked it, and sat on the closed toilet seat. Bryan remembered how to cry quietly, a skill learned in school. Boys who didn't learn this suffered from teasing. To cry silently, he tilted his head down and opened his mouth wide, turning sobs into quiet sighs. He would cough to cover any loud sounds. Tears fell straight onto the floor, leaving no marks on his face. The tears could easily be wiped away with toilet paper and washed down the drain. This way no one knew he was crying. Bryan's co-workers would never mock him, but he didn't want to talk about it. The best way to avoid discussing a problem is for people not to know it exists. Bryan had kept his affair with Siobhan a secret from his wife. If Becky knew Bryan had a secret, she would have asked about it in seconds. But Bryan decided to take the incident with Siobhan to his grave. Once he decided that, it faded into the background. It also helped that he and Becky were heading for a divorce. At the time, Becky tried to support Bryan during his problems with Eric, but the more she understood the financial impact, the more scared she became. Bryan had seen Becky's sharp tongue before, but he wasn't prepared for how cruel she could be when she was terrified. Becky and Bryan's love story seemed to be falling apart. Instead of finding her soulmate, Becky felt stuck in a marriage with a man betrayed by a friend who seemed to forget about his wife and family. It was a tough time for them both, and Becky blamed Bryan for everything, thinking he tricked her into believing he was a good man. After a harsh argument where she called him a loser, Bryan left home one Friday night. On autopilot, he drove to his office, even though he had returned the keys a week before. He saw a light in the window and rang the bell, hoping Eric was there alone. But it wasn't Eric. It was Siobhan. Bryan hadn't planned to do anything with her. They sat on the couch in Eric's office, and Bryan poured out his thoughts. Siobhan listened and was shocked by Bryan's life story. He started crying, and Siobhan comforted him, saying it was good that he trusted her with his feelings. Soon, Bryan found himself looking into her eyes. "Don't look at me like that," he said. "Why not?" she asked. "Because it makes me want to kiss you," Bryan said. "I want you to kiss me," she replied. "I've wanted this for so long." So Bryan kissed her. She then asked, "Do you want to go further?" Bryan replied, "Yes." "If we do this," Siobhan said, "I don't want to hold back. I know you love your wife, Bryan, and I don't care. I want this honestly." Bryan looked at Siobhan. He had never cheated before, though he had thought about it, imagining that his impulses would overpower him. But reality was different. He realized his desires weren't uncontrollable. They seemed distant and undignified. When Siobhan told Bryan she cared for him, it meant a lot. Bryan liked Siobhan as a friend and colleague. She took a risk by being so honest, risking his rejection. She wasn't the type to easily take such risks. Her boldness made Bryan feel valued. It made him feel like a real man in her eyes. It wasn't just physical desire Bryan felt strongly, but the urge to agree with her. Years later, sitting in a restroom stall, Bryan thought about that moment and the long call that followed. Siobhan had told him it was the best time of her life. Bryan felt the same way. She wanted to meet again, but by then, Becky told Bryan she was pregnant with Tara. This news shifted Bryan's focus to the future. Siobhan understood and wished him well without any hard feelings, which Bryan appreciated. Sitting there, Bryan had no regrets, except for getting caught. But he knew risks often have a price. He wondered how high that cost would be. Bryan flushed the toilet, left the stall, washed his hands, and returned to the cafe at work. The seating area was busy, but he could still see the table he had chosen. His lunch tray was gone, but the table was free. Meanwhile, Becky decided to take a weekend for herself to refocus. She spent the rest of the day productively and picked up Tara on time. Driving home, Becky told Tara about her plan. "Mom is leaving for the weekend," she said. "You'll have time with Dad." "Where are you going?" asked Tara. "I don't know yet." "Why are you going?" "I just need to be alone, honey." "But why?" Becky took a deep breath, not wanting Tara to feel blamed. She stopped the car at a crossing where other moms and kids were waiting. "Sometimes people need to be alone," Becky said. "For what?" "It helps you think. It's different from thinking with other people around." "I don't like being alone," Tara said from the back seat. "Of course, honey, I understand that. I never want to be alone." Becky glanced at her daughter's determined face in the rearview mirror. It made Becky wonder if she had ever said the same thing as a child, and how her own mother might have reacted. When they got home, Becky had some emails to handle, so Tara got an hour of tablet time. They sat together at the dining table, both busy with their devices. Later, Becky took Tara to a nearby playground, pushing her on the swing and watching her climb. When they returned, Brian's car was in the driveway. Tara jumped with joy as Becky opened the door. "Dad!" she yelled, running into the house. The joyful chatter from Bryan and Tara filled the kitchen, but unlike the morning, Becky felt no warmth from it. Instead, she was upset. She thought Bryan didn't deserve such love. Becky entered the kitchen and saw Bryan and Tara at the table. Tara's red jacket was on the chair. This sight annoyed Becky, and she grabbed the jacket. "I'll hang this up, okay?" she said coldly. Bryan bit his lip and took Tara's hand. Becky looked at Bryan and spoke sharply. "You'll make dinner for Tara, right?" "Of course," Bryan replied. "Fine, I'll go pack my things," she said. Becky left the room, hung the jacket in the hallway, and ran upstairs. She took out her suitcase and started packing clothes. A few minutes later, the bed was covered with clothes. Becky was deciding which sweaters to take when she heard a knock. Bryan stood in the doorway with Tara in his arms. Tara's face was against his shoulder and she was sobbing. Bryan held her tightly. "I think we need to sit down and talk," he said. Becky wanted to scream, "You did this. Handle it yourself." But she nodded instead. She cleared a space on the bed and motioned for Bryan to hand Tara over. Becky hugged Tara. Bryan sat next to them and put his hand on the bed. "Are you sad, dear?" Becky asked Tara. Tara nodded. "Why are you sad?" "Because you're leaving? I'll only be gone for a few days. I'll be back on Sunday, I promise." "But why?" "I told you, honey, I need to think about some things." "What things?" "Grown-up stuff. Things that would be unfair to burden you with." Asterisk. What is burden? Becky adjusted the baby in her lap while she thought about it. Bryan watched quietly with no expression. "A burden is something heavy," Becky said to Tara. "You know how we go to the supermarket, buy groceries, and then carry the bags to the car?" "Yes," said Tara. "Well, imagine I gave you one of those heavy bags and told you to carry it. Would that be fair?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I'm still little." "Exactly. Since I want to be fair, I will never give you a burden that's too heavy for you. Do you understand?" Tara frowned as she thought about it. She looked so cute that Becky had to resist hugging and kissing her chubby cheeks. "But Mommy," Tara said, "does this mean that you are carrying a heavy bag?" "Yes, in a way," Becky said. "An adult problem can feel like a heavy bag." "Can't Dad help you carry it?" "Not this time, dear. Some bags you can carry with other people, but some you must carry alone. The bag I carry is like that." "Can't you put it down?" Tara asked. "I'm thinking about it, honey." Becky hugged Tara tightly and rested her chin on the baby's head so she could look at Bryan without Tara seeing. "I'm thinking about putting the bag down," Becky said. "But tell me, Tara, what happens to the shopping bag if I leave it on the street and walk away?" "Someone else can take it." "That's right. And I would lose my groceries. So I need to ask myself, do I want to keep the bag or do I want to put it down? Because you see, my dear, some bags are worth carrying even if they are heavy, but other bags aren't." Becky lifted her chin from Tara's head and looked into her eyes. "That's what I need to find out," Becky said, "and it is very important that I understand everything correctly. That's why I need a couple of days to really think about it. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mommy." "And I'm really sorry that I can't tell you what it is. It's not because I don't trust you, my dear. It's because some adult things are too unfair to put on a child. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mommy. I love you, Mommy. "I love you too, my dear girl." Becky hugged Tara and cried, but it was a cry of happiness, so Tara did not cry. She just basked in her mother's love, hugging her back and feeling safe. Bryan watched as the two women in his life held each other. He then crossed his legs and quietly left the room. The Coach and Horses Inn was built in a time when men wore top hats and women wore petticoats. The horse yard has now become a guest parking lot. You book a room online instead of writing your name in a big leather book. Still, as Becky locked the car and walked toward the side porch, she felt like a traveler in a Charles Dickens story. She even carried a suitcase on wheels by the handle. The noise of the wheels seemed out of place and annoyed her. Inside, the old door revealed a room with dark wood and huge beams on the ceiling. The narrow staircase and reception desk were made from old oak or cherry wood. The room also had whitewashed stone and plaster walls. Becky loved it. The noise of a busy bar could be heard from the other end of the building, making Becky feel both welcome and excited. She walked up to the tall reception desk, which had an old-style hotel bell on it. Behind it was a modern swivel chair with a suit jacket hanging on the back, a computer monitor, keyboard, and cordless phone. It was a mix of old and new. Becky pressed the bell on the desk. Asterisk ping, ping asterisk. A well-dressed young man entered. Becky thought the jacket on the chair was part of a three-piece suit. The vest looked nice on his elegant figure. His white shirt was spotless and his tie was perfectly tied. Despite his broad shoulders and strong neck, there was a boyish look to his light curls and his smile. "Good evening," he said, approaching the desk. "You look well." "Thank you. Have you traveled far?" "About a 2-hour drive." "Fine. The kitchen closes in 10 minutes if you're hungry." No, I had dinner before leaving." "Very wise. Well, let's check you in." The well-dressed man turned on his computer and started typing. Becky realized she was staring and turned to look at a framed picture on the wall. "So," said the man, "Rebecca Robinson checking in for a 2-night stay with breakfast. I see you've paid in advance. Checkout time is 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. Everything is fine. We can look after any luggage if you want to spend the day in the area." "Thank you, but I have a car. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. I need to see some form of identification." "Oh!" Becky wanted to hit herself. The man looked puzzled. "Your driver's license will do," he said. "That's not the point," Becky said. "It's just all my documents are in my married name." "I understand." He frowned at the computer screen. Becky panicked. "I'm not here for anything bad. Madam, I just need to confirm your identity, that's all. The reasons for your stay are your business." Becky nodded and pulled a small wallet from her coat pocket. Her hands were shaking and she had trouble getting her license. When she tried to grab the smooth plastic, the nail of her index finger bent back. "Oh," she exclaimed. "Madam, I'm sorry." "I'm sorry." Becky burst into tears. She stood in this lovely room, her hair out of her bun, crying like a child. She was fine all that evening. Becky had dinner at home and then put Tara to bed. Later, she called Bryan from her car. With dry eyes fixed on the road, she listened as he told her about the night he cheated on her. Nothing he said surprised her. She felt oddly detached, like it was about a couple on TV, not her own life. Deep down, Becky always thought men were programmed to take chances with other women, and Bryan was no different. But now, Becky was hit by a wave of emotions she didn't expect. She barely noticed a man's hands, strong but kind, guiding her into another room. The leather sofa creaked as she sat down. He called for someone. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," Becky said, sobbing. "It's okay," said the man. "Take your time." Becky saw she was in a cozy living room with a fireplace and windows covered with curtains. A woman around her age walked in, holding a glass of water. She was dressed neatly in a vest and skirt. "Here you go," said the woman. "Thank you," Becky replied, taking a sip of the water. The man and woman exchanged glances. "Has this lady checked in yet?" the woman asked. "Not really," the man answered. "She still needs a key card." "I'll handle it now," said the woman. "Thanks, Katie." The woman left the room. The man sat next to Becky, his elbows resting on his knees. Becky drank the rest of her water and stared at the wall. "Sorry about that," she said. "It's okay," the man answered. "We all need a good cry sometimes." "Yes, but not when checking into a hotel." "This is not a hotel," the man smiled. "It's an inn. Try saying that after a couple of drinks." Becky felt a bit better and wondered what it would be like to kiss this man. He smiled back, looking into her eyes a bit longer than needed. "Katie will be back soon," he said, patting his leg as he got ready to stand up. Becky didn't want him to leave and said the first thing that came to mind. "Yesterday I found out my husband cheated on me." The man froze. "I'm very sorry to hear that," he said. "It happened years ago, but it doesn't make it easier." "No, it doesn't." The door opened and Katie walked in, holding a white plastic card the size of a credit card. The man stood and Becky followed, still holding the empty glass. "You're in room 3, Katie said. "I took the liberty of taking your suitcase upstairs." "Thank you," Becky replied. She exchanged the key card for the glass, then looked at the man and woman. "You were very kind." "You are our guest," said the man. "We take care of our guests." "And," said Katie, "the bar is open until 11 if you want a drink." The man turned to her. "The room has a minibar." "Yes, John, but there's a difference between sitting in a cozy bar and drinking alone in your room for the first time." Becky felt like these two were a couple. This feeling grew stronger when Katie gave her a knowing look. "Men, right?" Katie said. Becky lay on the bed, fully dressed, shoes off and on the floor, staring at the ceiling. It was whitewashed with a big wooden beam running the length of the room. This beam is probably 200 years old, Becky thought. She wondered how many stories this beam had seen. "Why am I thinking about this?" "Because you want to distract yourself," said her inner voice. "Yes," Becky thought. She started thinking about John from the reception desk. She imagined him knocking on her door, coming in with some excuse, and admitting he couldn't stop thinking about her. "Oh, God," she muttered. "I assume you're not talking to him," said her inner voice. "No, of course not," Becky replied in her mind, feeling frustrated. "Who needs a nosy mother when your own mind plays that role?" "I can leave if you want," said the inner voice. "Really?" Becky thought. "Sure. You can always make your own choices. I'm just here to guide you if you need." Becky lay there thinking about Bryan, Tara, and her marriage. She wondered if John was really involved with Katie and how complicated things could get. "Okay, what should I do now?" Becky asked herself. "Go downstairs and have a drink," said the inner voice. "No, I know what you mean. My answer is the same. Go downstairs and have a drink." Becky frowned. She expected a deeper answer. "Come on," said the inner voice. "Have a drink." She picked up her phone and saw there were just 10 minutes left until the bar closed. "You asked a question. I gave you an answer," said the inner voice. "It's up to you to follow it." Becky sighed, got out of bed, and opened her suitcase. She spent 5 minutes deciding what to wear, then realized time was running out. She put her shoes back on, grabbed her phone, wallet, and keycard, and left the room. She hurried down a corridor with pictures of horses and hunting scenes and entered the bar. No one was there except a young bartender, about 20, who was locking the main door with heavy keys and several bolts. He had light brown skin and a small, fluffy afro. His parents were probably mixed race. When he turned and saw Becky, his face softened. "Sorry," he said. "I'm just closing." "It's okay," Becky replied. "Are you staying here?" "Yes. Well, there should be a minibar in your room." "She knows about minibars," a woman's voice said. Becky looked back to see Katie walking down the hallway she just came from. Katie had unzipped her vest and carried a tablet and stylus. She walked past Becky and placed her things on the bar. "Come on, join me for a drink," Katie said. "Oh, Jake, can you bring me the schedule, please?" "Of course," the bartender Jake said. He came back to the bar. Katie sat down on a bar stool and started working on her tablet. Becky wasn't sure if she could join. Katie spoke without looking up. "You'll be more comfortable here," she said. "Sorry." Becky walked over and sat next to Katie. Jake printed out a long strip of paper, tore it off, and brought it back with a stack of papers. He smiled at Becky. "What can I get you?" he asked. "Oh, Diet Coke, please. Get her a real drink," Katie said. "It's on me." "Okay," Jake said. "What about you, the usual? For me, yes." Jake turned to Becky, eyebrows raised. "I'll have what she's having," Becky said. "Fine." Jake went to make the drinks. Katie was focused on her tablet, tapping with her pen and looking at papers. "I'll be done in a couple of minutes," she said. "Oh, don't worry about me," Becky replied. "I really appreciate it. Thank you. Well, after what John told me, I thought you needed it." Katie looked at Becky directly. Her eyes seemed to say, "If you have a problem with what John told me about your husband, now is the time to say something." Becky realized Katie was tough despite her professional look. Becky felt respect for her and nodded to show she wasn't offended. Jake brought 2 clear glasses with ice and lemon. Becky smelled the quinine and gasped. "Oh, God," she said. "Don't you like gin and tonic?" Jake asked. "No, I do," Becky answered. It was the drink I had with my husband the night we met." "What a nice coincidence," said Jake. His smile faded when he saw Katie's serious face. She signed the papers, handed them to the bartender, and raised her glass. "What do you want to drink to?" she asked. Becky thought about it. The first thing that came to her mind was to make Bryan feel bad. She wanted to hurt him, punish him, and ruin his life, but saying it out loud made her feel sick. "I don't want to forgive him," she said, "but I also don't want to be a resentful person. They always seem angry." "Who do you want to be?" asked Katie. "I want to be strong," Becky said, "but I don't know what that looks like here." "Then let's drink to finding out," Katie said, raising her glass for true strength. Becky felt a bit lighter. She picked up her gin and tonic and clinked glasses with Katie. "For true strength?" Becky said. Bryan was watching TV with his daughter on Saturday morning. After that, he made her breakfast and they went into town to do their weekly shopping. With a car loaded with groceries, he bought her a snack at a cafe and learned more than he ever wanted to know about the Powerpuff Girls. Back home, he let Tara play on the tablet in the living room while he unpacked the groceries. Bryan was halfway through when his phone vibrated. He saw the name on the screen and his heart skipped. Moving to a quiet spot, he answered in a low voice. "Hello?" "Hi, Bryan," his wife said. "How are you?" "So far, so good," he replied. "We just got back from shopping. Is Tara with you? She's in the living room. I gave her an hour on the tablet." "Fine." There was silence. Bryan thought he heard wind over Becky's phone. He guessed she was outside. "How do you feel?" he asked. "I don't know," Becky said. "I go from feeling one way to feeling the opposite. Sometimes I just want to go home and make things normal again, but other times I want to tear our life apart. Is it clear?" "I don't know, Becky," he said. "I honestly don't know. You usually have an answer for everything, Bryan. Not this time." Another silence. Bryan quietly closed the dining room door. "I have a question," Becky said, "and I need an honest answer. Do you still trust me, Bryan?" "Yes." "In a strange way, I do. Why?" "I'm not sure. I just trust my gut." "Will you give me your word, Bryan?" "Certainly." "Yes, you have my word." "Fine." Bryan heard his wife take a deep breath. "Since we've been together," Becky said, "how many times have you cheated on me?" "Once." "So that time with Siobhan was the only one?" "Yes." "Do you swear?" "I swear. If there's anything else, now is the time to confess." "I understand," Bryan said. "I know that if I hide something now and you find out later, you will leave me, right?" "Yes." "Okay, I stand by my statement. Siobhan was the only time." There was silence on the line. Bryan opened the door and listened to the sounds in the corridor. Tara laughed quietly at some game. Bryan closed the door and leaned against it. "Okay," Becky finally said. "I accept it." "Great," Bryan replied, trying hard not to ask if she was coming home now. He really wanted to be close to her again and held his breath, waiting for her answer. "Okay," she said at last. "I'm leaving now. Can I call you this evening?" "Sure," Bryan said. "Fine. Say hi to Tara for me." "I will. Bye." Becky and Bryan held the phone, waiting for the call to end. Becky switched off her phone, put it in her pocket, and looked at the view. She was sitting on a bench under a tree with rows of old tombstones in front of her, marked with dates going back to the 1800s. But Becky's eyes went beyond the gravestones to an old stone church standing under a blue sky with white clouds. This was the same church where she and Bryan had renewed their vows a few months ago. It looked just as Becky remembered, strong and simple, yet grand. It had been standing there so long, which somehow made her feel better. Becky would have liked to go inside, but the church was closed. A service would be held tomorrow morning, as it was Sunday. But Becky didn't want to go. She wanted to find her own understanding of God, not join others who already had their own ideas about him. "How do you feel?" an inner voice asked. "I don't know," Becky answered herself. "Try again." "Okay, I feel a lot of things, confused and angry, happy and sad. I feel bad that the church is closed, but if it hadn't been, I wouldn't have called Bryan, and it was nice to hear his voice. But it also confused me. Shouldn't I be mad at the man who cheated on me? It's a mystery, isn't it? Yes. Becky remembered her chat with Katie last night. They had talked at the bar until 1 in the morning, and Becky felt good about opening up to her. Katie seemed genuinely interested in Becky's story. She and John had been together for over a year but had no plans to marry, and Katie wasn't sure she believed in marriage. She wanted to know why Becky married Bryan. At first, Becky said, we were just caught up in a romantic dream. We met, fell in love, and thought marriage was the next step, like in the movies. Yes, Katie replied, but isn't it a little naive to think real life works like that? I used to think so, Becky said. But when you meet someone who seems to understand you and you have great conversations, you start to think maybe we'll be the ones to make the dream come true. Maybe we'll be the exception. That sounds a little selfish. Yeah, Bryan and I have big egos. Bryan sees himself as a man of truth, and I act like I'm special. Well, you are very lovely, you know. Thank you. I'm serious. If I were a man, I'd be into you. Becky laughed and clinked her glass with Katie's, accepting the compliment. But now, sitting under the tree and thinking about that moment, Becky started to wonder if there was more to it. Katie had been very direct and didn't seem like someone who said things she didn't mean. Why hadn't Becky noticed that then? Because Katie was still asking questions, an inner voice said. Yes, that's right, Becky thought. After understanding why Becky got married, Katie wanted to know why she stayed married. Tara, for one, Becky replied. Okay, you have a baby, Katie said. But what else? Becky talked about her relationship with Bryan, how they learned to talk better, and how their love grew as they accepted that neither of them would ever be perfect. But Katie kept pressing. Yes, but what does this have to do with marriage? Becky didn't have a clear answer then, but now, sitting under the tree in the cemetery, she realized they hadn't talked much about being parents. It seemed natural, as if marriage was the main thing and children were an extra part. For some, it is. But when Becky thought about why she felt married to Bryan and not just in a relationship, the answer was always the same. It was because they decided to have a child together. And now that Tara was here, Becky couldn't just erase Bryan. She could divorce him and throw him out of Tara's life, but Bryan would always be Tara's father. Becky could marry another man and tell Tara to call him daddy, but Bryan would still be her real father. She could even say that fatherhood didn't matter, but Bryan would still be Tara's father. Tara's connection to Bryan was as real and solid as the stones of the old church. She was made from the DNA of both her mother and father. Even though the people who built the church didn't know about DNA, they believed in the importance of family ties. Starting a family was the main reason to get married back then. The happiness of a husband and wife was secondary. Looking at the church, Becky realized this was why she felt so torn. As a woman, she believed she had every right to divorce Bryan for cheating. But as a mother, did she have the right to take away her child's father unless Bryan was dangerous or a drunk? The answer wasn't so clear. He wasn't simply good or bad. He was mostly a decent man and a great dad, but he did sleep with another woman once. Yes, it was wrong. And yes, he should have told the truth before their vow renewal. But does that mean he should lose his family? Becky felt that as a mother, the answer was no. Her womanly side was angry. If you had cheated, it screamed, he would have divorced you. I know, the motherly side replied. So why shouldn't you divorce him? I'm not trying to be fair to him. I'm trying to be fair to my daughter. But it's not fair to me. The womanly side cried about her right to happiness, respect, and an equal marriage. What is fair? It asked. If Bryan can sleep with another woman, I should have the right to sleep with another man. And let's leave Tara out of this. This is about me. Becky groaned, leaning forward with her head in her hands. Her stomach was tight and her neck and shoulders were tense. No wonder she felt this bad with such an inner struggle. The wind got stronger, shaking the tree leaves. Becky stood up, stretching her arms above her head. So much for peace and quiet. She headed back to the car, but knew the argument would start again once she got in. So she walked past the car and headed toward the hills. Around 6 p.m., Becky returned to the Catcher and Horses Inn. She walked through the reception area, where John was checking in another couple, and went straight up to her room. She took a shower, then put on a dress and heels. Looking in the full-length mirror, she wondered if she looked too dressed up. She didn't want to overdo it, so she wore a short denim jacket. There was a back staircase to the bar, but Becky wanted John to see her. She went down the front stairs to the reception area. She was lucky. John was alone at the counter. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "Good evening," he said. "You look amazing, if I may say so." "Thank you," Becky said. "Are you having dinner at one of our lovely restaurants?" "Actually, I was thinking of eating here." John's face became serious. "Our dining room is only open for breakfast," he said. "I know," Becky replied, "but you have a bar menu, right?" "It's not very large, just pub food, beef pie, chicken with potatoes." "That will be fine." Becky leaned against the front desk and looked at him. John got the hint. "I understand you and Katie had a good talk yesterday." "Yes, we did," Becky said. "You may be interested to know that Katie and I talked about you this morning." "Really? About what?" "Katie and I agreed that you are, without a doubt, one of the most beautiful women to ever walk in here." Becky's throat tightened. She had to look down at the counter. "Don't," she said. "You'll upset me." "Your husband upset you," John said. "Katie and I don't like it." "Me too." "Katie thinks he should learn a lesson." Becky slowly raised her head to meet his eyes. "What lesson?" she asked. "You know the saying, 'What's good for the goose is good for the gander.'" "Yes, I know." Becky looked at John's tie, thinking about his words. "That's Katie's opinion," she said. "What do you think?" "What do I think?" John leaned in and whispered in her ear. "I think I'd like to know you better," he said. Becky felt a reaction in her body. For a few electric moments, her breathing and heartbeat quickened. Then John let go of her hand and stepped back. "Go have dinner," he said. "I'm not hungry." "Well..." Becky paused, but it was clear to John what she meant. He smiled. "Katie will be at the bar later. She wants to talk." "What's going on between you two?" Becky asked. "Let's just say she owes me." Becky frowned, curious but not wanting to be seen with another man. She heard a couple approaching and nodded to John before heading to the bar. Around 9 in the evening, Bryan had put Tara to bed and was watching a movie he'd seen many times before. He was waiting for a phone call and wasn't in the mood for anything new. He couldn't focus, and when his phone rang with Becky's name, he felt relief. "Hello?" he said. "Hello, Bryan. What's wrong?" "Why do you ask?" "I can hear it in your voice." Silence. Bryan turned off the TV and sat down, all senses alert. "Where are you?" he asked. "In my room." "Are you alone?" "Of course I am. Why do you ask?" "Just a feeling. If I'm wrong, tell me. I'd like to be wrong." Another silence, speaking volumes. Bryan felt his chest tighten and began to pace. "Come on," he said. "Let's get through the worst." "I didn't do anything, Bryan. You haven't done anything yet." Again, a heavy silence. Finally, Becky exploded. "Damn you, Bryan! Damn you!" "Look, if I'm wrong, don't mess around. Tell me straight." "You know you're wrong." Bryan sighed, feeling a bit relieved. He sat back down and rested his head in his hands. He heard Becky clear her throat. "Do you want to say something, Bryan?" "Yes," he said. "Please don't do this. You have no right to ask that." "I'm not claiming my rights. I'm just asking. Please don't do this, Becky." "Bryan, please don't. This will happen whether you want it to or not." Bryan felt his whole chest tighten. Cool. This was the moment he had always feared. And now it was happening. One of his worst nightmares. His wife had betrayed him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He sat there trying to catch his breath. "Bryan," a voice came from the phone. "Bryan, are you still there?" "Yes," Bryan said quietly. "I'm still here." "You brought this on yourself, didn't you?" Yes, you understand this, right?" "Not really, no." "Well, you will have enough time to understand it. I have to go, Becky. Good night." "Bryan." And the phone went silent. Room number 3 at the Coach and Horses used to be one of the cheap guest rooms with 3 beds squeezed into a cramped space with a low ceiling. Today there was only a double bed against the back wall, but the space was still tight. Despite this, the current occupant used every inch of carpeting as she paced, turned, and waved her arms during a phone conversation. Becky deeply regretted her decision to call her husband. She had already decided to spend time with John and was even excited about it. Ironically, the only reason she called Bryan was because she had promised him this before and didn't want to raise suspicion. The plan was to ask about Tara, assure Bryan that she loved him, and she did love him, and then say goodnight. Becky could then go on with her night and return to her marriage, feeling like she had restored balance. But that plan was now in ruins. Bryan's intuition picked up from the first minute of conversation, and he pulled the rug out from under her feet. Becky turned off the phone so he couldn't call back and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Part of her mind was screaming, "Come on, girl!" And yet, seeing how beautiful she looked, she felt awful. Spending time with John no longer seemed like a fun adventure. It seemed like an act of revenge. Becky put the phone in her small purse, left the room, and headed towards the stairs. Katie had not yet appeared, and Becky hoped that she was already at the bar. Maybe deep down, Becky hoped that Katie would change her mind so she wouldn't have to make a decision. It seemed terribly unfair to her that the fate of her marriage depended on her. Although she herself had insisted on it, the bar was as busy as expected on a Saturday night, and there were 2 bartenders behind the bar. No, 3. Katie looked elegant, with her hair slicked back as she emerged from behind the counter with a couple of bottles of liquor. Becky found a seat at one end of the bar, and within seconds there was a gin and tonic in front of her. The service made her feel like a VIP. Becky sat sipping her drink and doing her best to avoid eye contact with the men looking at her. The last thing she wanted was for some stranger to hit on her, but she needn't have worried. After a short conversation with the staff, Katie walked up to the bar and sat down next to Becky. She looked her straight in the eyes, and for a moment, Becky thought the other woman might kiss her. "Hello, beautiful," Katie said. "Hi," Becky replied. "You look fantastic. You know that, right?" "Thank you." Katie waved for Jake to bring her a drink. Then she leaned towards Becky. "So here it is," Katie said. "On the other side of the stairs from your room, there's a door marked private. It leads to my apartment here in this building. John finishes at 10, so he'll be there in about 15 minutes. Just knock on the door." Becky took a long sip, the ice clinking in the glass. Katie smiled as Jake quietly placed the same drink in front of her and then disappeared to serve another customer. Katie leaned against Becky so that their shoulders were touching. "Are you nervous?" Katie asked. "A little." "Everything will be fine. I probably won't finish work until after midnight, so you and John will have plenty of time to talk and get to know each other better." "Why are you doing this, Katie?" "Not everyone believes in monogamy, Rebecca. You could even argue that we are naturally social beings and trying to be with only one person is unnatural. Are you saying that my husband did the right thing by being with another woman?" "No, I'm not saying that. If a man makes a promise, he has to keep it. And if he doesn't keep his promise, why should you keep yours?" "Because I made my promise to God," Becky thought. But she didn't say it out loud. She didn't want Katie to think she was a religious fanatic. Katie leaned over and kissed Becky on the cheek. "I need to get back to work," she said. "But do what you want. Trust me, Rebecca. I want this to happen as much as you do." Katie jumped out of her chair and finished her drink in one gulp. She then smiled at Becky and went back behind the counter. Becky watched the other woman with admiration. She absolutely owned the place like a queen with 2 bartenders who clearly adored her. Becky had never been with another woman before, or had never even been interested in it, and yet now she couldn't get the thought out of her head. Becky gulped down her gin and tonic. Her face was bright red, and she had a terrible feeling that everyone in the bar could tell she was worried. It was too much. Becky stood up from her chair, waved goodbye to her friend, and headed back to her room. There was still half an hour until 10:15, and Becky wanted to be ready when she knocked on that door. Bryan stood in the living room. He felt calm. There was the sound of crying, but it didn't come from him. It was Tara who was crying. She cried for her mother. Bryan looked around in a kind of daze. The entire room was smashed and destroyed. Shelves lay on the floor. There were books and CDs everywhere. There were holes in the walls from torn-off bolts. Everything. China and glass were in pieces, and all the curtains were torn off, along with the curtain rods, and lay in large piles. Bryan looked in amazement at the flat screen. He had somehow bent the thing in half, ripping it right out of the wall. "How did I do that?" Bryan wondered. He took deep breaths. He had heard the phrase, go into a rage, but he always thought it was just a saying. Now he knew it was real when he threw his phone at the picture of Becky's yacht and began his storm of destruction. Rage was a force, much like love or fear, and somehow, it felt okay. Bryan looked around at the mess and thought it was fitting. Tara's crying grew louder. She might start choking if she wasn't careful. Bryan went to the door, his feet crunching through broken glass and plastic. He turned off the light and gently closed the door, then quickly ran upstairs to Tara's room. Tara sat in bed, her face wet with tears and fear. She reached out the moment Bryan walked in, and he hugged her close. She was terrified by the noise and chaos downstairs. Bryan comforted her but didn't tell her that the monster was him. "I want Mom! Mom!" She screamed and cried. "I know, Tara, I know." Bryan sat on her bed holding her as she cried. She kept calling for her mother and her father stayed with her saying "I know" again and again. He didn't promise or lie, just held her until she started to calm down. As Tara's tears turned into sobs, Bryan thought, so this is what it feels like when your family falls apart. This surprised him. Movies always showed couples having big fights before breaking up. But as Bryan held his little girl, he realized the real problem wasn't Becky's anger or harsh words. It was her absence. That was the real heartache. "When will Mommy come home?" Tara asked between sobs. "Tomorrow," said Bryan. "What time?" "I don't know," he sighed. "Honestly, I don't know." In another room, Becky sat barefoot on the bed, waiting for time to pass. It dragged on slowly. There was no clock, so she turned on her phone. She was scared to see a message or a missed call from Bryan. There was nothing. Only 15 minutes had passed and no other notifications. Bryan had too much pride to call back. "He'll be fine," she thought. "Who are you kidding?" her inner voice asked. "It's tearing him apart." Becky's chest felt tight. She hadn't heard her inner voice since she sat on the bench outside the church. "Of course not," said the voice. "My job is to tell you the truth, and that's the last thing you want to hear right now." "He started it," Becky told herself. "It's all his fault." "I'm not here to blame," said the voice. "I'm just reminding you of what you already know. The choices you make tonight will shape the woman you'll be in the future. Why does it have to be a choice? Why can't I be Bryan's wife and have an adventure?" He did. "Are you pretending it's not a choice?" said the voice. "I thought you hated people who did that. He made me do it. It's not my fault, or most of all, I have a right to this." Becky bit her lip, tears running down her face. The inner voice continued. "Go have fun if you want," it said. "But don't fool yourself into thinking it's about Bryan. How can you say that? It has everything to do with him, only in the way you're trying to make him responsible for your actions. But he is responsible. If he hadn't cheated, I wouldn't have done this." This lie was so obvious that even her inner voice went silent. Becky felt a wave of guilt. She felt sick. Memories of dancing with Marcus DeVere popped into her head. Is this Bryan's fault too? "Yes," said the hoarse voice. "If Bryan was a real man, you wouldn't be interested in Marcus." Becky clutched her head, horrified how part of her tried to blame Bryan for everything. "God, I'm such a mess," she said out loud. "You're only human," said the voice. "Believe it or not, what you're going through is normal. Is it true? Certainly." Becky leaned on her elbows and stared at the floral curtains. The phone showed the time, 10:15. "What should I do?" Becky asked herself. "Decide who you want to be," said the voice, "and then make choices based on that. Where do I start? Last night you said you wanted to find true strength. Did you mean it? Or were you just trying to impress Katie? No, I meant it. Then start there. Decide you want to be a strong woman, a woman filled with love, a woman with honor, the kind of woman you want your daughter to grow up to be." "Okay," Becky said. "Fine. Now ask yourself," said the inner voice, "if you were already this woman, what would she do right now?" Becky didn't have to think long. The answer came quickly and she didn't like it. "Crap," she said. It was night on a dark sea that stretched out endlessly. Bryan stood on the deck of a small boat, looking at the horizon and listening to the water splash. He held onto a metal cable as the boat rocked gently side to side, and everything was quiet. Quiet like a grave. "Wake up, Bryan," he said to himself. "Come on, wake up." The wind picked up. Bryan felt it on his forehead and in his hair. Looking ahead, he saw the source of the wind. A huge wave stretched across the entire ocean, heading straight for him. It moved slowly like a giant mountain. Bryan tried to close his eyes but couldn't. He just stood there and watched as a giant wall of water came closer and closer. It got so big that it blocked out the sky, and he could see the water rising straight up in front of him. Bryan screamed and shook. His eyes were closed, but he could see yellow light through his eyelids. He felt someone's fingers pressing on his arm and head. "Bryan, it's me," said a female voice. Bryan opened his eyes for a moment. He thought he was still dreaming. Becky's face, her beautiful face, was only inches away from his. She was looking at him with a certain look. How can I describe that look? It was the look every man wants to see in the eyes of the woman he loves. It showed she knew him, liked him, and was very, very happy to see him. His brain tried to catch up with what he was seeing, but it was foggy and slow. Becky smiled and gently blew on his forehead. The soft breath made the hair on his forehead dance. "Becky," Bryan finally said. "Yes, it's me, but—" "No buts, Bryan, nothing happened. I'm still your wife in every way that matters." Bryan's eyes filled with tears as his slow mind understood her words. He felt so full of emotion. He held Becky close. They lay together. Becky half on top of Bryan, her thumb stroking his arm as he held her tight. Minutes passed. Bryan felt like he could burst from happiness. "I love you so much, Becky," he said. "I love you so much." "I know," Becky replied. "I never doubted it for a second. Even when I was at my lowest point, you still loved me. Sometimes I don't know how you do it." "Loving you is easy," Bryan said. "Trusting you is the hard part." "Yes." Becky sat up and looked at Bryan. She smiled, her eyebrows raised. Bryan looked back at her, not a bit of doubt in his eyes. He was too happy she was back. Becky saw this, and her eyebrows relaxed. She looked down and nodded. "I don't blame you for not trusting me," she said. "I don't trust myself half the time. I feel like two different people." "What do you mean?" Bryan asked. "When I drove home that night," Becky said, "I was having a huge fight with myself. Part of me knew I was doing the right thing, but the other part was so against it, so angry, so very angry. The thing is, if a man does something, then a woman should be able to do it too. And by choosing to stay faithful when you didn't, it was like I was betraying myself. Do you know what I mean?" "I think so," Bryan said. "You gave up something when I didn't. And part of you thinks that's unfair. Well, it is unfair. It's hard to argue with someone when you can see their side." "Yes, it's true." Becky sighed and leaned on Bryan's chest. She looked at the bedside lamp, her eyes getting distant. "Anyway, after a 2-hour drive, I finally got home," she said. "I tried to call you from the car, but you weren't answering, and I worried you might have taken Tara and gone to your parents' place. But your car was still in the driveway, so I thought, okay, he's still at home. I was still mad at you and hoped you would be happy to see me so I could make you regret it. I had some mean words ready, but when I got out of the car, I noticed there were no curtains in the living room. At first, I thought you forgot to close them, but no, the windows were like black holes, so I walked into the house with my suitcase, hung up my coat, and then opened the living room door and turned on the light." Becky grew silent, looking at the bedside lamp, tears filling her eyes. They rolled down and dripped onto Bryan's chest. She wiped her face with her forearm. She looked down at Bryan, moved closer, and stroked his forehead with her fingertips. When she spoke, it was in a whisper. "Bryan," she said, "I had no idea how much it would hurt you if I was with another man. I knew you would be mad, but not like that. Not so much. I'm really, really sorry, Becky." "No, let me finish. I can't say I have forgiven you, and I don't know what to do about it, but I hate what I did. Wanting my own adventure was a big mistake. I don't even know what the right thing is, but I know I missed it." "Yes," said Bryan. "Yeah, that makes sense. Oh God, Bryan, why do we do this to each other? Why do we hurt each other when we love each other so much?" "I don't know," Bryan said, his voice shaking. "I don't know." They both started crying. They hugged tightly, sobbing. They held on to each other like they were afraid of being torn apart. In the morning, Tara was excited when she walked into the bedroom and saw her mom. Becky tried to sit up as Tara bounced on her, talking about all the things she and Daddy did and superhero girls and many other things kids talk about. It took about 10 minutes to calm her down. Bryan made sure the door to the living room was shut tight before Tara was allowed downstairs. The three of them had breakfast together in the kitchen. Mother and daughter chatted while Bryan sat quietly. When they were done eating, Tara wanted to show her mom something on the tablet. Becky looked at Bryan. "Isn't he in the living room?" she asked. "Yes," said Bryan. "I'll get it now." "Is he safe?" "Yes, it seems so." Bryan stood up and left the room. He came back a few minutes later and Tara climbed into her mom's lap as he handed her the tablet. Becky saw there wasn't a mark on him. Tara was busy turning on the tablet while the rest of us told her mom she had something cool to show. But Becky kept looking at Bryan. He had messed up everything in this room. Why not the tablet too? "Because it belonged to Tara," said a small voice inside her. Becky felt a lump in her throat. She watched her husband pour another glass of orange juice. She was surprised to realize his violent side did not scare her. Instead, it made her feel safe. This man would fight for his family no matter what. Becky wondered what John would do for Katie. "Mom, you're not looking." "Sorry, honey." Tara was holding the tablet. Becky snapped out of her thoughts and paid attention to her daughter, but she felt a need to be alone with her husband. She suggested they all get dressed and go to the park. There was a playground where Tara could play, and Becky and Bryan could sit on a bench and talk. It was cloudy but not cold. The three of them went to the park. They walked along a path with trees alongside other families and joggers. Tara walked between her parents, holding their hands, and asked them to lift and swing her. Bryan stepped off the path and into the grass. The two adults walked, swinging and making Tara laugh and scream with joy. Becky noticed another couple doing the same with a boy, but she and Bryan were much more in sync, making Tara fly nearly horizontal with glee. They really were a good team, and Becky felt a chill thinking how close she was to losing it all. As the playground came into view, Tara ran ahead, squealing with excitement. Becky and Bryan followed her, holding hands. Entering through a small gate, they sat on a bench. Tara was already on the small castle, crossing the bridge to the slide. "Mom, look!" she shouted. Becky waved at her, then took Bryan's hand and leaned on him. "I love you, Bryan," she said. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied, squeezing her hand gently. "And I'm really glad you came home last night." "Me too. It was a good decision." They sat for a while, enjoying each other's company and watching their daughter. Becky then asked, "Can I ask you a question, Bryan?" "Sure." "If a man with a knife ran out of the forest, would you risk your life to protect me?" "Of course I would. Why do you ask that?" "You're sure, Bryan? Who would I be if I didn't?" "Okay," Becky said, "but what if I had been unfaithful? Would you still risk your life for me?" Bryan's muscles tensed. He went quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice was hard. "I probably would," Bryan said, "but I'd be angry. I'd think it should be the other guy risking his life." "That's what I thought," Becky said. "Do you want to tell me something?" "No, I'm just trying to understand," Becky said. "It's clear the best thing for our marriage is for me to stay loyal to you. But for this to work, I need to let go of the fact that you weren't loyal to me." Bryan nodded slowly. "It still bothers me," he said, "and if I don't let it go, it will ruin our relationship." Becky leaned back, watching Tara play on a horse spring rider. Bryan moved closer, put his arm around her shoulders, and kissed her head. "I'm sorry I put you in this situation," he said. "Thank you. I appreciate that." "Is there something I can do?" he asked. "Oh yes," said Becky. "There definitely is." It was the first time they had been close since everything came out. As they walked home from the park as a family, Bryan suggested Becky take Tara somewhere while he cleaned the living room. Becky shook her head. She said the mess was as much her fault as his, and she wanted them to clean up together. This touched Bryan deeply. Becky called her best friend, Tara's parents, to see if she could spend the day with them. When Becky returned home, she kissed him gently. The two of them cleaned the house together. Later, they talked softly, letting old wounds heal. No longer were they trying to hurt each other with words or actions. Bryan held Becky close and told her everything she wanted to know. It was not the story he had expected to tell, but being open about his mistakes, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. They had found a new way to connect, and now they were stronger for it. Bryan had a colleague he worked with for 5 years. They were good friends and he respected her a lot. He also found her attractive, but he thought nothing would ever happen between them. One night they were alone in the office. Suddenly he realized he wanted her. He wanted to stay married, but also wanted to be with her. It felt like a dream. Becky asked him if he had fantasies about this colleague. Bryan admitted he did, especially when he first started working with her. Becky was skeptical when he said the colleague had a rule about not dating co-workers, but noted that they weren't colleagues anymore when it happened. She suggested maybe the colleague wanted to be with him after he started dating Becky. Bryan hinted that if he was risking his marriage, he might as well make the most of it. Becky laughed, calling him a monster, and they joked. Then, she got serious and asked if his colleague wanted him to tell his wife. Bryan said no, and Becky called her a nasty name, acknowledging a rivalry between them. Becky asked if she should feel okay about the affair. Bryan was confused. Becky admitted she understood why he did it and didn't feel threatened. Instead, she didn't see him as a hero who resisted temptation. She suggested dealing with the situation in another way. Then, Becky confessed she was upset not because he cheated, but because she missed a chance to sleep with someone else, Marcus Dover. She was angry about having to say no to that opportunity now. Bryan was surprised but didn't have an answer. He saw how upset Becky was too and felt guilty. Becky got mad, accused him of being unfair, and ran out of the room crying. Bryan heard her lock herself in the bathroom. He decided to clean up the mess he had caused earlier around the house. Later, Becky came downstairs dressed casually, still upset. Bryan joked, but then admitted he didn't know what to do. Becky hugged herself, feeling insecure. Bryan led her to the sofa and held her hands. He told her the affair wasn't just great sex, it turned into a secret he had to keep, which felt like a rat hiding in the house. Sometimes he forgot about it, but other times it was all he could think about. In the end, he got caught. He said you met her by accident. And then the secret came out. The mess started, and it was crazy. Yes, I see it. I'm not talking about the room, Becky. Breaking that room happened because of the idea of you being with another man, but that wasn't the worst part. Oh my God. The worst part was hearing you say at my work cafe that you wanted to leave. He said this with no anger, no blame, no mockery in his voice, just some dark emptiness. At that moment, I felt I had lost you. I saw my whole life slipping away, and I knew it was my fault. Bryan stopped talking. Then Becky let go of his hands, sat on his lap, wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him. He hugged her tightly and felt great relief and gratitude. Dr. Jekyll is back. I heard you, Bryan, she said softly. I heard you completely. You're saying that if I want what you had, I need to accept the same risks and live with a rat under the floor. Oh yes, with a rat. But listen, Becky, I want to say something about this adventure you want. Becky sat down so they could look each other in the face. Her eyes sparkled and her expression was playful, mischievous. Speak, she said. Look, I cheated on you and got caught. Bryan said, and you have to pay a price for getting caught. And I think that if you want to keep bringing up sleeping with another man for the rest of our married life, then maybe I deserve it. In fact, I know a lot of people who would see it as punishment. Oh, Bryan, I don't want to be the woman who hurts you. I want to be the woman who loves you. Yes, I know, but Bryan, don't you understand? I feel like you don't deserve my love because you cheated on me. That a man who cheats loses the right to his woman's love. So, to move forward, I have to say forget this feeling and choose to love you anyway. But do you know how hard that is? Bryan looked at Becky's pained yet beautiful face and wondered how he could ever see this woman as a stubborn teenager. She could be so clear, so sure, and exact. At times like these, he not only loved Becky, but also felt deep respect for her. Not the usual respect men show women to avoid being sexist. No, it was real respect coming from knowing she was very smart. He was dealing with a woman who could see right through him and be very honest with herself, more than any other woman he had known and often more than himself. Bryan looked at the woman in his lap and felt, Becky, he said, I want to apologize. You already apologized. I'm not talking about her. I want to apologize for always and endlessly underestimating you. Becky's eyes filled with tears. She looked at her husband and said, Continue. It is clear to me, Becky, that if things were switched, I couldn't handle this with even a fraction of the grace and courage you are showing. You can see how I handled it with your betrayal. I would have destroyed our marriage, and that would have been it." Bryan put his arm around Becky and held her. "But what did you do?" He said, "You kept it to yourself. You gave yourself time to decide what to do. Now, I don't know what happened while you were away, but I assumed you wanted to punish me or find some quick way to get back at me. I also see that I think I am the one taking this marriage seriously, while you are in it for what you can get out of it. But if that were true, you wouldn't come home in the early morning. You wouldn't have wanted to be close even though you were still mad at me. We wouldn't have these talks. And I am very sorry I looked down on you, treated you like a child, and thought I was the smarter one in the marriage. I'm an idiot, Becky. Damn you, idiot!" Becky cried in his arms. Bryan didn't sob, but tears ran down his face as he held her. He felt so lucky to have Becky as his wife with a depth that was new to him. Yes, she was Jekyll and Hyde, but who wasn't? And Jekyll's part was much better than he gave it credit for. As for Mr. Hyde, well, he could find ways to deal with it. She was worth it. Becky checked the arrivals board at the airport where she was to meet her parents. Their plane had just landed, but they still had to go through passport control and get their luggage. Becky thought she had at least half an hour. It was late, and the big windows showed only night darkness. To make up for it, the airport's inside was bright and flashy, with glowing signs everywhere. Becky walked to the arrivals area where her parents would come out and looked for a place to sit. There was a coffee shop near large sliding doors where passengers came out with their luggage. Becky stood in line, bought herself a latte in a glass mug, and sat down at one of the small tables. She felt good. In fact, she felt great sipping her latte. Becky looked around, hoping to see a woman in a raincoat with cherry red hair. Honestly, this woman looked much better as a blonde, if she showed up now. Becky could tell her every detail of her evening with her husband. How interesting, Becky thought. She still wanted Bryan to be reliable, but she didn't want him to be tamed. She remembered watching a dog training program on TV. On the screen was a beautiful German shepherd with a piece of raw meat in front of him. His loud owner bragged that the dog wouldn't touch the meat until he got the signal, even if he was really hungry. Becky thought it was sad, even silly. A healthy dog should jump at a piece of meat, and a man should want to be close to a woman, even if she says no. Becky thought it was strange if the man didn't show any interest. That was the problem. Becky understood Katie's point that liking other people was normal and maybe even good. But she also agreed with Bryan that if they started being with other people, they would lose the special bond that made their marriage special. They had to choose. This made Becky upset. She wanted both things. But as time passed, she started blaming Bryan less and reality more. After all, it wasn't men's fault that life was unfair. Though Becky knew few women who thought like this. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her mom saying she and her dad were at the baggage carousel, waiting for it to start. Becky finished her latte and looked at the crowd of people waiting for their loved ones. Some held signs or balloons. She thought she could enjoy her spot for a little longer. Her thoughts went back to the hotel. Becky knew she might never see this place again, or maybe in 20 years. She and Bryan would pass it on their way somewhere else, and she'd tell him the story. She hated that Bryan didn't care about her time there after she listened to his stories. It felt unfair. If she could do it for him, why couldn't he do it for her? But there were many things Bryan did that she didn't want to do, so she might have to accept it. But going back to that weekend, Becky ended up knocking on the door marked private a little after 10:30. John opened the door and saw the nice woman from room 3 in a coat and boots, with a suitcase by her side. Always kind, he didn't try to change her mind, but went to the front desk to check her out, and even offered to refund her money for one night. Becky firmly refused. "I feel bad enough about this," she said. "Well, don't," said John. "I respect your choice, and I think your husband is very, very lucky." "Thanks, but I'm going to give him a hard time when I get home. I bet he'd rather take it from you than be with any other woman." This touched Becky, making her eyes sparkle as she sat in the airport coffee shop. She thanked John again, asked him to say goodbye to Kathy, and left the hotel. She got into her car and drove out of the old yard onto the road for the long drive home. But as Becky thought about her choice, she realized that her regrets weren't about not being with John. They were about the closeness she could have with Katie. Becky checked her phone. It was time to join the crowd waiting. Sliding doors opened regularly, letting out passengers with luggage carts and bags. Becky found a spot out of the way, away from the noisier people. There were shouts of joy and hugs, many small reunions. Becky crossed her arms and began tapping her foot, waiting. "Dad!" cried a little girl, running toward where Becky stood. The girl was with a couple standing nearby, and the man walked forward to catch the child in his arms. Becky wondered why the woman stayed back, then realized she wasn't the child's mother. No, the mother pushed a luggage cart loaded with bags, with a boy about 10 walking beside her. He looked at his dad's friend with clear anger and said to his mom, loudly enough for Becky to hear, "What is she doing here?" Becky tried to look at the sliding doors and ignore the scene nearby. It felt like a tense situation from a Cold War spy movie. It got worse when the boy started crying. Becky looked up at the ceiling and sent a silent prayer of thanks. "Keep something for yourself," said an inner voice. "Even the best advice is useless if not listened to." Becky sighed with relief and turned her attention back to the sliding doors. They opened, and there they were. Mom and Dad finally came out. Both of her parents were tanned, which contrasted with their silver hair. Otherwise, her dad looked much the same, with the same neutral frown on his face, pushing the luggage cart seriously. But her mom looked different. She wore a colorful Hawaiian blouse that should have looked silly, but didn't. She looked happy and younger, waving at Becky. Her dad pushed the cart past the barrier, and Becky hugged them both. "How was the trip?" she asked. "Fantastic!" exclaimed her mom. "Oh, Becky, you can't imagine." "Can we talk in the car?" her dad interrupted. "Of course, dear," said his wife and turned to Becky. "Your father doesn't share my excitement for adventure." "I had quite a good time," he said, "but I'm also looking forward to being home." "Okay, give me a minute," Becky's mom said, taking her daughter's hands and looking into her eyes. "How are you, Becky?" she asked. "I'm doing great, Mom." "Really? You look wonderful. Is it true?" "Yes." "Did something happen while we were away?" Becky laughed and kissed her mom's hands. She looked at her mom and said, "Mom, life happened." She let go of her mom's hands and hugged her dad's shoulders. "Come on, let's take you home," Becky said. Her dad nodded gratefully. Soon, the three of them were walking through the arrivals hall. The old man pushed a cart. His wife chatted, and their grown-up daughter walked next to them, pulling her mother's suitcase across the shiny floor. Hey, listeners! If you enjoyed watching this video and want to stay updated with our latest content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss out on what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video with Queen Cheating Tales.